We have a drone that attempted to allegedly attack the Kremlin, and there's a video of this actually. The drone was blown up, and Putin, part of Russia, accused Ukraine of an attempted assassination. Ukraine denies the alleged claim. And now the question is, how did that drone get there? Were there any explosive or weaponized equipment on the drone? Was this targeting the Kremlin, or was it just someone flying a drone and somehow the local air defense didn't catch the drone until later on? Or was this a fabricated incident, a fabricated event by the Kremlin to induce panic and to be able to have another event to blame Ukraine of what's going on over there in that region? Now, I want to tackle the latter statement that I made, which is this could potentially be a false flag operation. Now, let me first say this, let me preface everything. Russia and Ukraine, even though they're on opposing sides right now, Russia is being backed by China now, and Ukraine is backed by the West, largely America. These are opposing forces, but they both have blood on their hands. Russia has done a bunch of terrible things. Ukraine has done a bunch of terrible things. We have the leaked Pentagon papers that showed Ukraine has actually lost a lot more lives than Russia has. And so the Western media that we're getting here has been deceiving us about how the war efforts have been going, because they are saying, the Western media, they've been saying that Russia is on the brink of collapse and they have been losing. But the Pentagon leak has shown us the documents that Russia is in fact not losing as bad as Ukraine, and thus we're just fueling the war efforts for no justified reason other than to satisfy the people at the top of these different industries. Now, why would Russia fabricate an event? Well, this is a common event, a false flag operation event. This is common to have one party scapegoat another party, to use an event as a catalyst to spark public sentiment, either national, local public sentiment, to be able to push for a certain cause. In this case, this would help Russia fund their military war efforts against Ukraine and against the Western Front, and nationalize, galvanize their people together so that they would support what the Kremlin is doing. Now, the West does this all the time, not specifically America, but a ton of nations. Nations in general have been doing this since the idea, the conception of deceptiveness. We falsify events, or we leverage events, even if they happen unorchestrated. We leverage events to points of catalysts, and then we push that to the public, the general public. The general public needs to see some kind of effort, some kind of emotional reaction, some kind of spark for them to support a cause or be against something. So just like we had 9/11, we had terrorist events, and that galvanized the public. There was a poll after the events, and a vast majority of the nation supported going to war overseas in defense of terroristic acts. So you have the vast majority of the population, not just in America, but populations in general, they will support a cause if there's enough of an emotional spark to create that public sentiment. There has to be a big enough event to spark that. Now, I've said this before, but often what we'll have is in certain parts of a generation, there will be certain focuses that are ideological or financial. These motives, these interests are pursued by the people at the top of corporations and by people at the top of different institutions and federal governments. And to get the people on board, they have to have micro events that contribute towards the macro event. So the macro event may be a war between Russia and Ukraine, where both sides actually benefit. Despite the casualties, you have people at the top of leadership, they don't necessarily care about the casualties if this is a war to fund their financial and ideological interests. So an interest for Russia may be, they want to conquer their territory, they want to take back certain territory that was part of the USSR, but this also helps fund their military efforts, and industry profits off of that. The same thing in the West. The West has military bases all over the world, so there is a type of manifest destiny still in effect. But when we have the United States, and they're spending trillions of dollars collectively, but hundreds of billions, tens of billions at a time, giving it to the war efforts, and along that line of the war effort, there are people skimming money off the top. Okay, different entities, different corporations. Obviously, the Ukrainian regime profits and benefits off of that. So you have multiple parties that are benefiting off of that, even after the destruction, after the war effort is over, whether it's 1 year or 10 years. The reconstruction is given to certain entities in the United States of America who will fund the operations via taxpayer money. So the taxpayer is giving the government money, not voluntarily. you're coerced and complied to do it. Otherwise, the use of force will be used against you. You'll be in prison. So the federal government gets money, and then after a place has been destroyed, the federal government contracts certain private institutions, private corporations, to go to those places and reconstruct those areas. And the federal government is going to use taxpayer money to fund those private institutions. So it's this revolving door in a sense that, it's more like a circulatory system, right? Private corporations are funded by the federal government, aka the taxpayer, to destroy a place, and then private corporations are funded, again via the taxpayer indirectly, to reconstruct these places. So ultimately the taxpayer loses because we're funding both sides of the war, the start and the end. Now, we have to understand that the macro changes every generation. There's a few things that you can do within a generation, because every generation, the next generation is going to forget about what happened in the previous generation. So even right now, 2023, most people don't understand what happened in 2000. Let alone what happened before then with the Vietnam conflict and all that. So the current generation is almost always manipulated. Let's use Pareto's principle. 80% of the population is almost always manipulated to the point of, oh, there's a bad event, whatever the event is, war, conflict, invasion, foreign invasion, pandemic. It's all the typical themes, the typical motives. And then when you're part of the population, you're not informed, you're ignorant, you're uneducated by design. You're overfed with malnutrition, you're underfed with not enough nutrition. And so you really only have one narrative to follow because you're so distracted by bread and circuses, and you're not willing to do the due diligence, to put in the effort, time invested to match what the 20% of the population is doing, which is actually looking into these artifacts. And so these systems, these people make up the systems, but these people in these systems, they can reiterate the same type of agency to create conflict, whatever the conflict is, and they will spark emotional reaction with micro events. So let's say the macro event takes 5 years, okay? Macro event takes 5 years. Micro events need to occur every few weeks, every few months to spark interest in the macro event, to have the public engaged. If you don't have the public engaged, how can you continue to have public sentiment to fund your war efforts? After a period of time, even the 80% of the population will say, hey, you know what, there's nothing new going on here. Inflation is going up, my money is going less further than it was before, I'm getting paid less, there's less opportunity in this nation. People become disaffected, and when you're at the top in government, corporations, if you're in the elite class, let's say, and you have any kind of ruling stake over the population, you understand from a psychological point of view, there are tangible aspects to this too, but you must maintain the equilibrium of society. I've said this before, but the French Revolution occurred because the equilibrium for society was broken. So there's a certain threshold. China understands this really well. They're able to have an authoritarian control over their population, but they know where the equilibrium is. They know where the threshold is. They have to maintain a certain standard of living for people, certain accessibility for people, to be able to revoke certain liberties from them. The people are okay with that because they can afford a middle class or upper middle class lifestyle. They can buy their EVs, they can still eat out, they can do what they need to do to a certain threshold, and they're okay with that because they're content, right? They're not extremely happy and grateful about the situation that they're in. They don't have all these myriad of opportunities, but they're content at where they're at. They're satisfied. When you break that threshold, you get the French Revolution. People are sick and tired of what's going on with the government, what people are doing with their interests instead of fulfilling the interests of the people. It doesn't matter what country you're in. Even if most countries don't have the United States Constitution because they're not the United States, so they don't have the understanding, the idea, or the concept of public servants serving we the people for their specific interests. But inherently we understand as we the people, whether you're in Mongolia, China, wherever you are, that you collectively have interests. And if those interests they're not even being met, or you're being abused as a people, over time that equilibrium is broken. That threshold breaks, and there's a flood of outrage. So this is how rebellions occur. I'm not saying we're going to be in the midst of one. I'm just stating. Now North Korea has done they're an example of they're able to break that threshold only because they're able to starve their people to a point where their people, they can't even think about rebellion. They're thinking about food 24/7. And North Korea only survives because China is fulfilling their fulfilling their products and services, they're giving them resources, right? So North Korea is able to thrive, but only because they're keeping their population weak enough to not even have the idea or the wherewithal of how to push back. And in fact, in North Korea, there is some pushback now, but it's still very contained. It's not going to be widespread because there's too many negative consequences going against them right now. Now, for the rest of society, as long as you're not getting resources from another nation in a substantial amount, the people always have the potential to push back when they see that, hey, look, you're causing all these catastrophes, you're causing chaos overseas. This is only hurting us because we have to pay into the system, and then you're using that system to fund your interests, and you guys, you families at the top are all benefiting financially, ideologically. This is something that we're no longer tolerating. So when news like this comes out, when there are leaks that come out, when, I don't want to say sketchy, but suspicious events, suspicious activities come out, and people identify the data, and they look through the details, and they see that things are not matching what the government is telling us. And in fact, the reality for us, we the people, is prices are going higher, there's a war overseas, we have mass inflation, people can't find jobs, people are more divided than ever, and the people who are coming into the government are saying that they're trying to be cohesive with each other, but they're really dividing people on purpose. This is going to spark a lot of outrage. So when we see events like this where there's a micro event, this is just another micro event. Next week there will be a new micro event. The week after that there will be another micro event. But we have a micro event. We don't know if it's Ukraine. We don't know if it's Russia. There's propaganda on both sides. It's very hard to discern what's true, what's not. Even though there's a video of this, now we have artificial intelligence, and these deepfake videos are getting so good that we can't even identify what's realistic or what's fabricated. So now they can doctor video and audio to such an extent where we don't even know what's legitimate, right? This is a very difficult thing to identify. And then it's always an arms race of what is truthful and what is false. And especially when we have our media outlets who work in tandem with the federal government. Instead of being independent press, they work in tandem with the government. And so they often put out false information. And so even when they put out this video or they report this news, how can we affirm that this actually happened? This was an actual event that occurred. We have no idea, right? Oftentimes we're just taking what these legacy media are doing, unless they're independent journalists who are going on foot to the actual places, the countries, and they're actually filming and writing about this. And then we have to be able to trust these individual creators or individual journalists to see if they're credible and trustworthy enough, right? So that's a whole task on its own. Most people are not even going to do that. They're not going to do that due diligence of looking at these independent creators and determining what's truthful, what is false. Are these people trustworthy? Most people are going to watch cable news. They're going to turn on the TV, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, Fox News, whatever. They're going to see what's occurring. They don't realize there's an agenda behind that media apparatus. So when it comes to these micro events, all we can do is use our critical thinking. But first, we have to be well informed. We can't be ignorant. We have to be well nutritioned, which there's even the food pyramid, something we've been learning since we were kids, is a whole lie on its own. We know that excessive amounts of carbohydrates contribute to dementia, being obese, being overweight, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, a whole host of problems. And it's still taught in schools. We're not taught what we should actually be eating, right? So we have to be able to have the right food so our guts are in tune, and there's actually a lot of neurons that connect with your intestines and digestive system. So if you're not thinking clearly, if you're very hazy or cloudy in your head, how can you have the right critical thinking skills to assess everything? Then you actually have to go out and research. You have to gather data. And then you have to talk to people. You have to collect different perspective. And then you have to sit and think and meditate on all this information and data and see what you can conclude. And you have to be able to do that at the same time as you're getting all these distractions from people who are manipulated, brainwashed, or from the media itself. That's a very difficult task for most people because that takes hours upon hours of time. And most people want to sleep. They want to have a social life. They want to go out and eat. They want to party. And they have a job. That's very difficult to do in a 24-hour time period. I won't lie. But that's why hopefully independent creators, we are seeing that they're gaining more momentum over legacy media. We're seeing that with Tucker Carlson. A bunch of people stopped watching the 8 p.m. slot that Tucker had. I think it's 8 p.m. Eastern time. And instead, independent creators are getting a lot more attraction, a lot more views and traffic because people are realizing I can go to these places, I can subscribe to them, even though I got to go out and look for it and search for these independent creators and filter through these people, and I have to subscribe to them individually, I can still get a more coherent answer that is maybe, I'm saying this from an audience member, me as an audience member, me as an average Joe. I can't articulate it myself. I know the different narratives that are out there, but these independent creators provide me some clarity into what's actually happening out there in the world. Because ultimately what's happening out there in the world, political policy, fiscal policy, how culture adjusts, that's all part of it. And that over time affects you. That affects you individually. And so if you're saying that you can't get a job, or and I'm not saying this is the case on, like, when something changes politically, like a law changes politically, one, it's not going to happen, it's not going to affect you overnight. So it's not going to change anything overnight most of the time. It's not going to affect you financially or culturally a week later. And sometimes it's not super direct, right? It's a lot of indirect things that affect you later down the road. But a culmination of these things do affect you over time. I will say your local politics matter the most, but definitely state and national politics affect us all when you put everything together. So these little events, we want to be able to identify what's actually happening out there in the world, and what are, especially here in the US, what our politicians are doing to ensure that we should not be in this war. Instead, we're seeing the exact opposite. We're spending tens and hundreds of billions of dollars poured into this war, and we, the American citizens, are not getting anything out of this. We have to understand where the interests align, where there are incentives, and why people are pursuing one interest over another interest. And then we get to the truth.